So without further ado, I think that you chose this session because you want to learn a little bit more about the rule of law. And this is what we are really trying to do here. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the objectives. And sorry, I'm going to clear all the drawings here. The first and foremost, we're going to talk a little bit about the UN and UNODC and how we work with the rule of law, and a little bit about the different perspectives on what the rule of law is. And in addition, we are going to talk a little bit about how the rule of law is present within the SDGs, and a few different takes about how we can identify and engage with the rule of law in different SDGs. And finally, talk a little bit about the decade of action. So 10 years left within the 2030 agenda. What does this mean for the rule of law? And there's going to be a little bit of brainstorming as well. So, but before we start, I'm going to ask a few questions, and maybe we can write them in the chat. So first question, what do you guys think the rule of law is? Maybe you can put a few questions, a few remarks in the chat. When you think rule of law, what comes to your mind? So write it up in the chat if you can. Justice from Ana Cristina. Anyone else want to give it a shot? Yes, justice is very much related to the rule of law. No one is above the law from Ariana. The spirit of the law, says Naomi. Yeah, those are very interesting responses. Justice in politics. No one being above the law. Again, Meenakshi. Equality in legislation. So we have a few things going now, as we can see. We are talking about everyone being equal before the law. No one is above the law. Justice, equality. Obeying instructions to live in a safe and secure environment. Justifying constitutions, legislations to maintain prosperity and peace. Very interesting responses, and they are all in one way or another related to the rule of law. Humanity, yes, that's also very important. We cannot forget humanity. Liberalism, freedom. Let me change the question a little bit now. And as we're going to see the SDGs, and when we talk about the rule of law in general in the context of the SDGs, there are a few things that usually come to our mind. And part of what I'm going to do here is talk a little bit about these different things. So I have another question here. What do you think causes more deaths worldwide? And this is related to SDG 16 in particular. Is it armed conflict or homicide? What do you guys think? A, armed conflict. We have 2 for armed conflict right now. So far, only Naomi thinks it's homicide. Pretty much everyone's going for armed conflict. Ariana also thinks it's conflict, but pretty much everyone is going for, oh, sorry, for homicide, but pretty much everyone's going for armed conflict. Well, Nika, yes, they both cause a lot of deaths, but between these two, I think that we're trying to what I'm trying to go at here is between armed conflict and homicide, which of these two is responsible for more deaths worldwide? Just between these two. Valeria also thinks it's armed conflict. Adreni thinks it's homicide. I'm not going to give you the answer right now. Let's hold on to that a little bit. And last question, and this is related to what Stephanie just posted. When we talk about human trafficking, what do you think the largest share of identified victims are? Do you think it's men, women, boys, or girls? So actually, let me, I'm going to ask Hiroki for help. So maybe you can read some of the responses in the chat.
Boys and girls, woman, and there's like BND.
So women and girls.
Yeah.
But I think most people are going for, if I'm not mistaken, women and girls. Right here. Oh, a few more responses.
Yeah, it's mostly women and girls.
Okay, that's what I also thought. Okay, so I'm gonna pause this here, and I'm not gonna give you the answers right now, but I'm gonna give them to you a little bit later. These questions so far have been about a few different things that relate to the rule of law and the SDGs. When we talk when we talk about the rule of law, that is related to a whole bunch of different topics that I'm going to say a little bit more specifically soon. And it's also related to one specific target under SDG 16. But when we talk about armed conflict and homicide, we're talking about a specific target under goal 16, which is target 16.1. When we talk about human trafficking, this is actually in a number of different targets of the SDGs. I'm going to show them to you a little bit later. But to wrap up the discussion right now, I'm going to put the correct answers here. Between armed conflict and homicide causes more deaths worldwide. And we published a report last year in UNODC, which is the global study on homicide, according to which there were over 400,000 homicides in the world in the period that was studied, while there were only around 80-something thousand armed conflict related deaths. And we also published on a biannual basis the global report on trafficking in persons. And according to that report, the majority of victims identified in the case of human trafficking are women. So there you have a few of the responses. And all of these relate to some of the rule of law SDGs. But okay, I've been talking a little bit about what the rule of law is, and maybe you guys want a little bit of answers now. So I asked you before what the rule of law means, and the UN has a definition for that. And I'm going to put the definition over here. It's very long, but I don't want you to focus on it. I just want to say that if you ever want to look up what the UN sees as the rule of law, you can go to un.org/rule of law, and they will have that definition there. But just in case you're curious, this is the definition of what the UN considers as the rule of law. So you can see that a lot of the things that we talked about are in this definition. For example, accountability to the law, equality, justice. Nobody really mentioned human rights, but human rights are an important part of the rule of law. And people also mentioned, obeying the law, and it's also, this is related to the supremacy of the law. So it's really important to remember that the rule of law is not a simple thing. There are multiple dimensions to it, and they relate to many of the things that you already think concern the rule of law. So it's very important that you know that the rule of law is related to a lot of these things. But I work at UNODC, which is one of the UN offices that works on rule of law issues. And at UNODC, we work with specific dimensions of the rule of law. And they can be clustered around a few different topics, which are the core rule of law issues that UNODC works with. And they are the following: corruption and integrity, crime prevention and criminal justice, organized crime. And organized crime includes, for example, trafficking in persons and migrant smuggling, firearms trafficking, cybercrime. We also cover a lot the issue of terrorism and violent extremism, as well as wildlife, forest, and fisheries crime. And this is really important for us to consider, because when we talk about the rule of law, we normally think that may be a little bit abstract. But when we think of these topics, for example, the topics that UNODC works with, it's easier to identify what some of the challenges are to the rule of law. So I just wanted to leave you guys with that for now. Okay. We all know what this is, right? I mean, this is why we are here. The interesting thing about the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is that for the very first time, Goal 16 has been identified as part of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And this says a lot. It means that the rule of law is key to the SDGs. You cannot achieve the SDGs without the rule of law. Now, let's think a little bit about these topics that we just saw and the 2030 Agenda. I'm going to ask you a different question now, and maybe you can annotate again. Which SDGs do you think? Actually, let me backtrack a little bit. One of the key things about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they are, can someone think about what I'm trying to say? When we think about the SDGs, we need to think about what? How do we look at them? Does only one goal matter? You can use the chat and Hiroki will help answer. All goals matter, they're all interconnected, as Ariana said. Yes, that's very important. So one of the key things about the 2030 Agenda is that while we do have one specific goal about the rule of law, which is SDG 16, this is important to achieve all of the other goals. But more than that, and this is one of the things that I wanted to show today, we need to realize also that many other goals have targets related to the rule of law. Can any of you, and now you can maybe use the annotation, or maybe you can type in the chat, to answer this question, which SDGs have targets that are directly related to the rule of law? Can anyone think of them? And you can use the annotation button. I'm obviously going to put SDG 16 because this is important, but do any other goals have targets related to the rule of law? Hiroki, can you help me read out some of the answers?
There's some that says reducing inequalities, decent work and economic growth, And
a lot of
quality
people.
education. Oh, sorry.
No problem. A lot of people are circling goals 4 and 5. Goal 8, goal 9, which is 9 is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Goal 17 has also been circled out, which is a partnerships goal. 11. Life on land, someone said it, even though it's not circled. Goal 13, climate action, someone said. Well, let's give that a pause right now, and I will clear all of the drawings, and we will see what the actual answer is. So let's see if you all got this one right. So these are the goals that have specific targets related to the rule of law. Goal 4, quality education. Goal 5, gender equality. Goal 8, decent work and economic growth. Goal 10, reduce inequalities. Goal 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. Goal 15, which is life on land, and goal 16. So this is one way of looking at the SDGs and how they relate to the rule of law, looking at which ones have specific targets on rule of law topics. But what I want to present to you is a different approach, which is the approach that was created by a group of countries and academics, which call themselves the Pathfinders. And the Pathfinders created an approach to look at the rule of law and the SDGs that focuses on the different connections across all of the goals, not only those that have direct linkages and direct and specific targets related to the SDGs. So the Pathfinders developed this approach based on the title of goal 16, which, and this is also a little bit of a problem because goal 16, if you think of it, has a really long name, and that's how they use to break this down. So goal 16 is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And this and a few different resources you can find on the Pathfinders website, which is sdg16.plus. And what they came up with is a way to look at the SDGs related to the rule of law based on these 3 pillars: peace, inclusion, and justice. And they call on everyone to think of the SDGs as more than just 16. Look at all other goals and how they can relate to it. This is why they say 16 plus. So what are these dynamics and what are these goals and which targets they hit? So when you think of peaceful societies, these are the targets that the Pathfinders think are related to peaceful societies. So you have, for example, all forms of violence here, which also relates to armed conflict, but we can also think of violence against women and girls, which is target 5.2. Then there are a few others from goal 11, which relate to public spaces, and that's also in, institutions and facilities in urban spaces such as schools. Safe migration, we can relate safe migration to human trafficking and migrant smuggling. Child labor, child soldiers is also related to human trafficking and migrant smuggling. Arms flows, that's firearms trafficking. So you see that different goals can relate to different topics that we focus on at UNODC. But that's peaceful societies. If we look at just societies, we have another set of targets and goals, such as, for example, policies and legislation for gender equality, or legal identity, education on human rights and gender equality. And target 4.7 is actually much broader than this, but it is just an example of. And finally, inclusive societies. This talks about public access to information. If you don't have information, you can't participate. And a way to ensure access to information is by promoting transparent and accountable institutions, which is also a good way of reducing corruption. And you also relate that to participatory decision making. And that's, also related to reducing poverty and education. So this is a very interesting and integrated approach to the rule of law SDGs that the Pathfinders came up with. And this has, to a very good extent, been guiding the work of the UN and other different institutions. I'm going to ask you another question now. What is the name of the event where UN member states, civil society, and the world takes stock of how we are advancing the 2030 agenda? Does anyone know? You can use the chat. You can also unmute yourselves and speak if that's possible. I think we can make this a little bit more interactive.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. What is the name of the event at the UN where member states, civil society, all stakeholders come together to take stock of the SDGs, to review how they're being implemented? General Assembly? Naomi got it. It's the HLPF. But what does HLPF stand for? Does anyone know? High-level political forum, that's right. And last year in 2019, the high-level political forum was very interesting because for the first time, there was a specific session where member states could take stock of the different SDGs. And I'm going to share with you a few findings from the HLPF in 2019. And these findings also come from a report of the Global Alliance for SDG 16. I'm going to tell you where to find that report. But just to explain, the HLPF is the event at the UN where member states come up with other stakeholders and they assess all the progress that is being made towards the achievement of the SDGs. And up until 2019, they were done in clusters. And in 2019, the cluster included SDG 16. And what was the key message that member states, civil society, the private sector, academia, everyone talked about? Well, the key message was not enough is being done. And this was also echoed by the Global Alliance report. The Global Alliance for SDG 16 is a group of international organizations and civil society organizations, which has also, for example, UNODC and the UN Development Program. And they put together this report that took stock of what needs to be done to advance SDG 16. And you can find this report, and I put it right here at sdg16hub.org. And some of the key findings of this report were that there is not enough political and financial investment to advance the goals related to the rule of law. More needs to be done, for example, to address violence against women and girls. And not just political will, you need to invest in it. You need to put money so that these actions can take place. Another important thing that we need to understand, and this is exactly why we are here at the Global Summit 2.0, we need a whole of society approach to advance SDG 16+. It's not just the police or judges, prosecutors, and state actors who have a role in advancing SDG 16. Everyone needs to do it. And not just that, we need to ensure that no one is left behind. And what does that look like in the context of SDG 16? It can take many different phases or many different forms. So when we think of human trafficking is mostly linked to vulnerability. And it's about the people who either have no access to education, who are in poverty. So we already see there a link between SDG 16 and 10 and 8, which have targets on human trafficking, and goals 1 and, for example, 4, which are on poverty and education. We need to look at how crime, justice, and rule of law issues affect different people and who are the most vulnerable. And this is really important now in the decade of action. This is the last 10 years that we have before the 2030 agenda is up. And last year and earlier this year, it was all about how to ramp up the achievement of the SDGs. And this is what the Global Alliance and HLPF tried to do, is take stock of everything and come up with a few key issues for what we need to do in the decade of action. But then the pandemic happened. And maybe what I would like to do now is just pause a little bit and see if we can have a little bit more of an interactive discussion. You can speak or you can use the chat, and Hiraki will help me look through some of these. And but maybe I'd like to hear from you guys a little bit about how you think the pandemic will impact the achievement of the SDGs. Does anyone want to take the floor?
I think that maybe a few of the goals will kind of take a backseat right now, because with COVID, everyone is racing towards having a vaccine. So while some things like the goal for healthcare might advance, other things like gender equality or the environment might not be as important anymore.
That's great, Naomi. It's one of the risks we face with the pandemic is that we put certain priorities, and for example, health should definitely be a priority, but that this might not be done in a way that ensures that everything is done equally. So we put some things first while others remain in a lower priority. Does anyone else want to take the floor?
I think like the COVID-19 will bring many impacts, like trust within the government, like in a bilateral way, because right now what we are seeing within the COVID-19 that there are many people who are not trusting China or who are like cut out from the international organization due to lack of information and trust. I think we are losing the trust due to COVID-19, and there would be some problem. I think I read an article that they're saying the SDG might be delayed within reaching their goal in 2030. They might extend the goal due to the COVID-19 issue.
That's a great point. And Anwar, one of the things that we need to consider is that trust is very much related to how people don't see public institutions working for them. And that may be for a number of different reasons, including corruption. Yeah. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would agree, because like I have seen that in many countries, like within USA and in other lower developing countries, where the corruptions is coming out in the light within the public eye. And there have been like mistrust or less trust within the government in their own countries or institutions.
That's a great point. And as I was talking, when I was showing the slides about inclusion, and inclusion depends on the capacity to participate, and participation, which is one of the targets under SDG 16, depends on another target of the SDGs, which is access to information, which depends on yet another target of SDG 16, which is transparency and transparent and accountable institutions. all of these things relate to corruption. And the COVID pandemic, I mean, UNODC recently published a paper specifically on corruption in the context of the pandemic and how it's important to ensure transparency and integrity in the public sector in the fight against the pandemic. So we are already stretched because the pandemic showed the lack of trust in institutions. This is an important take. Anyone else want to think about, want to add something else?
Sure, yeah, I'll add something. So I definitely agree with both of the previously mentioned points from Anaral and Naomi. And I have to admit, like, the COVID-19 pandemic, it's truly setting a precedent for the entire world. And I think with that comes the need for the SDGs to also develop. Initially, when these were created, there was no global pandemic around the world, but now there is. And I think what's really important is that we take this information that there's a pandemic and move forward with it to develop the SDGs and maybe even change our goals around or change the way that we reach our goals. I think that's really important for all world leaders and youth to understand as we progress through the pandemic.
That's a very good point, Ariana. Hiro, do you want to help out with Jafar?
Okay.
What he put in chat?
He feels like the pandemics only brought our structural deadweights into the limelight, showing how things weren't really as good as we seemed to think. Things like structural racism, the Yemeni crisis, the Uyghur crisis, the climate change inevitability, the impacts of the US foreign policy, the rise in authoritarianism, everything was already there. It's just that we've become more open and, to be fair, more concerned with these issues simply because we're seeing the adversity firsthand.
Absolutely. And many of these things relate to the rule of law. When you talk about authoritarianism, remember that one of the key aspects of the UN definition of the rule of law is the avoidance of arbitrariness. And arbitrariness is exactly what authoritarianism is. And all of these things relate in many different ways. And I think that going back to what the other participants were saying just now, one of the things we need to be concerned is health is a global priority right now, but the UN is set on rebuilding better. And rebuilding better in the context of the SDGs means we need to look at them together in an integrated way while leaving no one behind. So we can't advance. Now we have the pandemic put us also in a situation where we were all set back in so many different ways, and we have this chance to rebuild in a different way. And in the context of the SDGs, this means let's do this in an integrated manner. Let's not leave anyone behind. Anyone else want to add anything with regard to impacts of the pandemic? Maybe, talk about specific topics in the context of the rule of law. Maybe I'll ask a different question then. How do you think, for example, the pandemic has impacted SDG target 5.2, which is on violence against women and girls? Does anyone want to address this? Tracy, we can't hear you. Is it possible for you to put your answer in the chat? It's cutting a little bit in terms of connection. And while Tracy puts her response, does anyone else want to add something on the topic?
Yeah, I'd like to add that I'm sure that the pandemic has definitely increased domestic violence rates, especially towards women and girls, as that was already set beforehand in cases of domestic violence. And I think the idea that people are staying home more, they're confined to their houses in quarantine. And with the negative impacts on mental health that might increase substance abuse, I feel like there's an increase in domestic violence towards women and girls.
Absolutely. Yes, I'm sorry, Harky. Do you want to read out that answer?
Yeah, Muhammad brought up the fact that considering the rule of law in the pandemic, the crime rates have a sharp increase in many of the developing countries due to unemployment in this pandemic, as it makes them to do such things in order to survive. And this is pretty tough for the governments to overcome. And this is related to the earlier question you asked.
Absolutely. So here we have the overall problem, which is related to goal 3, which is health and well-being, affecting goal 8, which is employment and decent work, and which has an impact on a range of other SDGs related to the rule of law, as for example, goal 16, which has some targets on crime-related issues. So that's a great way, Mohammed, of showing us how this trickle-down effect of one goal on the others has in the context of the SDGs. Now, let me ask, I'm going to go back a little bit to the presentation here. Just give me a second. Okay, everyone can see this, right? So we just talked about different, let's think a little bit more specifically in terms of the goals and the different targets. I don't know if this is maybe too small for you guys to see, but I've put here some of the targets that are directly related to the rule of law within the context of the SDGs. And we were talking about how the pandemic has affected some of them. And for example, Mohammed just talked about the relationship between goal 8 and a number of other ones. So unemployment, poverty, and health. But how do you think, does anyone want to say, for example, how target 15.7, which is related to life on land, and also just mentions poaching and trafficking of protected wildlife species. How is this related to the rule of law, and what is the deal with this in the pandemic? Does anyone know? Does anyone want to give that a shot?
Nora brought up that the pandemic has caused lots of problems, and it showed us that some of the strongest health systems are strong after all, and the number of people living in poverty is rising as food aid has been stopped, and not all people can get their education as schools are shut down. Currently, many schools are using distance learning, and this is considered as a privilege to poorer countries.
Absolutely. It's definitely a privilege in many settings. I asked just now what, let me use the annotate here. I asked just now what the deal was with target. Let me just see. Oh, sorry. I was just trying to use the annotation, but it seems to be not working for some reason. Anyway, let me just go back. My question was about target 15.7, which is on wildlife crime and poaching of illegal species. This very much reminds us of how the pandemic started, which is what the health sector refers as a zoonotic disease, which is a disease which has an origin in an animal or an animal species, and then it crosses the barrier to another species. And this is very much what the coronavirus is and how it evolved. And target 15.7 is a direct target that focuses on this very aspect. And I think that it's important that we also think of how this relates the rule of law to the environment, to health, and to what everyone is living right now. But my last question, and I think that I want to, I mean, we have time for general questions. Unfortunately, we cannot go over time because we will all need to jump straight into the plenary. But one thing that I wanted to ask you guys is, remember that a few slides back, I mentioned, let me see if I can go back quick enough. When I was showing you guys the definition that the UN has for the rule of law, I mentioned that human rights was a key part of it. And this is what I want to end this conversation with. And maybe let's use some of these targets also to talk about the context of a decade of action and the pandemic in thinking about human rights and the targets related to SDG and the rule of law. Can anyone help me think what rights are being affected by the pandemic and in the context of rule of law and justice? So, for example, when we talk about reducing violence, we're talking about the right to safety and the right to life, and that we need to protect this right. What else are we talking about when we think of the other targets related to the rule of law and the SDGs, and how have they been affected by the pandemic? Equal access to healthcare. Anyone else? We were talking about the right to health.
Right to education.
Right to education. Let me just give you guys an example here. Target 16.3 talks about access to justice, and I do apologize if this is too small for everyone to see, but when we talk about access to justice, we talk about a very fundamental right, which is the right to a fair trial. What about everyone who is either a suspect of a crime or someone who needs redress from the criminal justice system or protection from criminal activity? How are courts working during the pandemic? Are things being put to a hold? I think that the overall goal of this conversation, and I'm really sorry, but I've been asked to conclude, is to really think about how the pandemic shows that, one, the SDGs need to be looked at in an integrated manner. We need to think outside the different little boxes. And our challenge now that the pandemic has showed is that in the decade of action, this is what we need to think of. This is what needs to be a priority for everyone. And I'm just going to put here while I close and open for maybe just one or two questions. If you can already put them in the chat, if you want to maybe ask questions in the 2 minutes we have left before going to the plenary. But if anyone has a question now, feel free to ask and I will answer before we all head to the plenary. And you can use the mic too if that's easier instead of typing.
I just want to say thank you so much for an amazing presentation. This was such a great way to kick off the Global Summit. And I did have a question regarding your job. You said you work for the UNODC, the Drugs and Crime Prevention area of the UN. What exactly does that entail for you on a day-to-day basis? What do you do in your job?
Great, thanks a lot, Ariana. And I've been just asked to make that the only question. Otherwise, we're going to be late for the plenary. So very quickly, As you know, UNODC works with all of those areas that that I showed you before, and we have different kinds of work here. Most often, it relates to developing training programs for member states to make sure that they can fight and address those different forms of crime. So that training can either be to police on how to investigate, and to prosecutors on how to, lead trials, and judges on how to judge these crimes. It can be about developing victims programs. It could be about how to, for example, work with the prison system to ensure that prisoners are treated with dignity and that everyone's human rights are respected in all of these processes. Another part of the work of UNODC is normative, which is developing standards and norms. So for example, helping develop basic normative frameworks and laws and legislations in the member states. So let's say a state wants to develop a law on organized crime, that would be pretty much it. And there's also a little bit of work of helping the UN intergovernmental bodies. So when member states come to debate and negotiate resolutions. And we also work a lot with academia and the education sector and schools, and helping youth throughout the world to understand some of the topics that we do. But I see Vedant just popped up, so I think that he's going to tell me that it's time for us to wrap this up. So I'm really sorry, but we're gonna have to head off to the plenary now, and I'm very grateful to be able to share this time with you guys. And thank you so much. I'm gonna, if you look at the MUN Impact Twitter, they put my contact information there somewhere on Twitter. So you just feel free to touch base, and thank you very much. And I'll see you all at the plenary. And I'm sorry that I couldn't answer all of the questions. And also thank you to the great admin team, especially Hiraki, for the support with reading the questions. Take care, guys, and I'll see you at the plenary.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for attending this session. It was really great for you, for us to hold you this